дамы и господа, уважаемые коллеги, дорогие наши студенты, я рад приветствовать вас сегодня в этом зале, потому как мы продолжаем очень добрую, хорошую традицию Воронежского государственного университета. Мы встречаем известных, замечательных людей, интересных людей, и сегодня наш гость, чрезвычайный полномочный посол Ирландии в Российской Федерации, господин О'Лири. Я хочу сказать о том, что это не просто направление сотрудничества с Ирландией, это уже 5-й визит посла Ирландии в Воронежский университет. У нас есть Центр ирландских исследований, у нас есть хорошая история, как сейчас говорят, кредитная история взаимодействия с ирландскими вузами, с ирландским сообществом, и поэтому этот визит очень полезен. Господин посол приехал на 3 дня, вчера уже была встреча с губернатором, и на этой встрече были обговорены очень интересные моменты взаимодействия ирландской стороны и Воронежской области. Есть интересные проекты, касающиеся и Воронежского государственного университета. Уважаемый господин О'Лири, перед тем, как мы перейдем к важной процедуре подписания меморандума о взаимопонимании, о согласии, я прошу сказать несколько слов коллегам. Вы видите полный конференц-зал, и ваш визит ожидаем и долгожданный.
Уважаемый ректор, это мне большая честь говорить здесь сегодня. К сожалению, я стараюсь, и я постараюсь учить русский, богатый, красивый русский язык, но сейчас, по крайней мере, я не могу читать лекцию по-русски, поэтому я буду продолжать английский. Спасибо. It's a great pleasure to speak here today in Voronezh State University, a university of great history and achievement. I would like to thank my friend director, Professor Dmitry Yendovitsky, and the head of the Irish Centre, Professor Alexander Moroshnikov, for making this event happen today. Your university has a long tradition of Irish studies, and we have today reaffirmed the close links, as my predecessors have when they visited, between the Irish Embassy and the university. And we will, of course, deepen that by signing a memorandum of understanding after my address. Ireland and Russia have played pivotal roles in the development of European culture. While we are at the edges of Europe, we are very much part of Europe. And Ireland, indeed, as an island of saints and scholars during the Dark Ages following the collapse of the Roman Empire, has been described as saving civilization, because it was in the monasteries of Ireland where all the ancient texts, many of the ancient writings of Rome, many of the biblical texts were preserved by Irish monks living in cold and damp cells, producing works of art which last to this very day. If you visit Dublin, I would strongly recommend you go and look at the Book of Kells and imagine how a group of pastoral peasants basically produced a culture that could produce such a work of art in the 7th and 8th century after the birth of Christ. Russia, of course, has enriched European music, art and literature over the centuries. In fact, it is impossible to imagine European culture if you take out Tchaikovsky, Dostoevsky, Pushkin, Tolstoy. Could you imagine a European culture without Russian culture? I don't think you could. Both our countries, of course, have known very dark times. In Ireland's case, these dark times lasted a very long period indeed. My talk today covers a very broad field, and I will therefore only cover the highlights, and as the Rector said, I will take questions at the end. Modern Ireland to put it in context, even after the recent economic crisis, and we had a very bad economic crisis, is a highly developed nation. It is a member of the European Union and a member of the Eurozone. It has a GDP per capita that is 126% of the EU average. GNP, which excludes foreign investment, still leaves Ireland at a very respectable 97% of the EU average. To put that in context, in 1988, the Irish GDP per capita was 60% of the European Union average. So over the last 30 years or so, we have managed to close that development gap. And indeed, if you go back to the 1950s, Ireland was a very poor country. So this is a very recent development, and I'd like to give some of the reasons how we managed to make that leap. One economic historian has pointed out that over the 20th century to the late 1950s, not only were people leaving the country, those who stayed did not experience a significant improvement in their standard of living. Indeed, Ireland has moved from an outlier in terms of underdevelopment to the other side of the curve. And my purpose here today is to attempt to explain why, with a particular focus on its engagement with the process of European integration. Ireland, like many small countries, has had a difficult relationship with its larger neighbour. In fact, between the arrival of the Normans in 1169, we don't particularly like to remember that it was the Irish who invited the Normans to come, but I think when we invited them to come, we thought they might stay for a year or two. We didn't expect them to stay for 700. And the achievement of independence in 1922, it was in part or whole an island subject to the rule of England and later Britain. And of course today, the northern part of Ireland is still part of the United Kingdom. The relationship between Ireland and the United Kingdom, Great Britain, England, did not work to Ireland's advantage. Our relationship with Great Britain has, of course, been marked by some typical Irish humour. The story is told that when, after a long struggle, Ireland achieved its independence, one of the leaders of the independence movement, General Michael Collins, arrived to take the seat of Dublin, British government in Ireland, Dublin Castle, from the forces of the Crown. He was greeted by a very irate and a very proper British officer who said in a stern voice, "You are 7 minutes late." And General Collins replied, "Well, you have had it for 700 years, we won't grudge you the 7 minutes." And it would take too long today, and indeed it's, I think Oscar Wilde said, the truth is rarely plain and never simple. And so it would take very long today to recite in full the history of Ireland's relationship with Britain. However, after many twists and turns, by 1801, Ireland was governed directly from London, with power on the island itself in the hands of a government which was dominated by the Protestant minority, who had defeated the Catholic majority in the wars of the 17th and 18th centuries. The rural landless population had become dependent on subsistence farming, and in particular on the potato, which allowed the Irish population to grow very, very rapidly, and indeed, as we found to our cost, to overpopulate the country. When the potato failed in successive years due to the blight, in the mid-1840s disaster struck. More than 1 million people died, and a shift in agricultural landholding patterns established a pattern of immigration which lasted for over a century. Following the Great Famine in the 1840s, Ireland suffered more than a century of economic and population decline. In 1841, the population of what is now the Republic of Ireland, the 26 southern counties of the 32 counties of Ireland, was 6,520,000 people. By 1901, this figure had dropped to 3,220,000 people. And despite a very high birth rate, by 1961, it had fallen further to 2,810,000 people. Between 1841 and 1961, in contrast, the population of England rose from 13,600,000 people to 41 million people. And over that period, the standard of living of those people living in England was higher than the small population living in Ireland. It is difficult to think of another part of the world that experienced such a long population decline. When you think that in 1841, I think the population of the world was about 1 billion people, and today it's over 7, almost 8 billion, I forget the number. When you think of it in that context, this, of course, unhappy experience within the United Kingdom was a key factor in energising successive generations of Irish nationalists. Isaac Butt, Charles Stewart Parnell and John Redmond tried to develop home rule within the United Kingdom by constitutional methods. But building on the Easter Rebellion of 1916, a newer, more radical generation of Irish nationalists sought full separation from Britain, and indeed they achieved this following the War of Independence for the southern portion of Ireland in 1922. However, independence and before separation from Britain, there was a rather naive view that if we could get rid of British rule, it would be a panacea, and that all our problems would be solved, that Ireland would suddenly become rich and so on. And it did not bring a major change in economic fortunes. A number of factors drove this poor performance. First was the predominant dependence of the economy on agriculture, with a very large number of small and often inefficient farms. Second was the disturbed political and economic environment following independence, which included a civil war. And then, of course, in the late 1920s, we had the Great Depression, followed by economic tensions with Britain, where we had a trade war with Britain, and then we had the Second World War, and of course that made it difficult for small countries to prosper. Third was an excessive reliance on protectionism and import substitution. Following a short experiment with free trade in the 1920s, Ireland moved to an economic system focused on building domestic industries behind high tariff walls. Unfortunately, this policy failed to produce a dynamic industrial sector, and the failure to catch the European boom of the 1950s, as Ireland clung to clearly outdated economic protectionism, led to continued high emigration and poor growth. To be fair, in the 1930s, everybody was protectionist. We got into a system that has been described as a beggar your neighbour system, that we all thought we could build prosperity on our own. But in the 1940s and 1950s, the world moved in the direction of free trade, and Ireland was slow to pick up on that. And we lost a whole decade, really, where we could have developed the country better. Kenneth Whitaker, one of our most brilliant public servants, sent a note to the government in 1957 saying, "It is accepted on all sides that we have come to a critical and decisive point in our economic affairs. It is only too clear that the policies we have hitherto followed have not resulted in a viable economy. It is equally clear that we face economic decay and the collapse of our political independence if we elect to shelter permanently behind a protectionist blockade. For this would mean accepting that our costs must permanently be higher than those of other countries, both in industry and large sections of agriculture. That would be a policy of despair. The effect of any policy which entailed relatively low living standards here, would be to sustain and stimulate the outflow of immigrants and make it impossible to preserve the 26 counties as an economic entity. This was the most senior civil servant in the state, and this is what he sent to the government in 1957. The country was in a total crisis. 40,000 people were emigrating a year. To put that in a context, what does it mean in terms of family? In my own family, my father had a family of 9. One of them died in youth, relatively young. 2 of them emigrated to the United States. 1 of them emigrated to Canada. 1 of them emigrated to the United Kingdom. 1 of them became a nun, a religious nun in Belgium, and 2 of them remained in Ireland. And in my mother's family there were 4 children. She had 3 brothers. 1 brother inherited the farm, so he stayed, got married. He got married quite late actually, because you couldn't get married while your parents had died basically, or your father at least. And then my mother married my father, obviously stayed in Ireland, and one of her brothers went and served in the British Army in England, and one of her brothers went to America. And in 1946, our statistical society did a projection of the population of Ireland from 1946 forward, and they had this enormous chunk called emigration. It was just accepted that the country would not be able to support the people it was producing. And of course that led to tremendous feeling of inferiority, and it took a new policy, this stark reality combined with a changing of the political guard. Eamon de Valera, who had been one of the founders of the state, one of the founders of the leaders of the rebellion, made way for Sean Manasse, who had also been in the rebellion but had more modern ideas, as Taoiseach, or as we call her, Prime Minister. And this set the conditions for a radical change in national economic policy. It involved reducing the barriers to free trade, encouraging foreign firms to base themselves in Ireland, and an expansion in state investment in support of development, particularly in the areas of education, infrastructure and urban development. Ireland's education system was at the time particularly underdeveloped. In 1955, 1950, some very small percentage of the population went to university. I think in the entire country of 3 million, there were 7,000 people in third level education. And even in terms of secondary education, we were a long way behind the European average. And over the next 50 years, we reversed that. We now have very high standards of third level education, a very high level of education generally. There was, however, even though we were moving out from protectionism, moving into the world, there was no great enthusiasm for a return to a fully free trade environment. Ireland's previous experience under British rule had left a sour taste in that regard. The application of free trade principles during the Great Irish Famine in particular had left a very vivid impression on the public mind. While there are differing views amongst historians, I can testify from my own childhood, talking to my parents, talking to my teachers, that there was a near universal belief that Britain had done too little, too late to help the victims of the famine, which decimated the population of the country. And if you go to America and talk to Irish Americans, that belief is very, very well seated. Now, historians might argue that this was the policy of the time and so on, but there was a change of government during the famine, and that change of government led to a move from subsidised food to working for food. And that particular policy did not work in Ireland, did not work at all. There was, of course, a mythology around Ireland before the old Ireland, which James Joyce in Ulysses, those of you who have read it, and I would recommend that you read it, it's a very good book, will come across a speech by the citizen, who was Joyce's encapsulation of the Irish nationalists, condemning the woeful effects of British rule. And one of the lines he had, "Where are our missing 20 millions of Irish should be here today instead of 4, our lost tribes, and our potteries, and our textiles, the finest in the whole world." While Joyce was having some fun at the citizens' expense, there is little doubt that many people then and now in Ireland believed that a free trade environment without a broader framework of support meant that Ireland would suffer while the larger countries and the larger neighbour in particular prospered. We don't have strong natural resources, we're on the margins of Europe and so on. Ireland, as recently as the 1980s indeed, when discussing the idea of a single currency, a former governor of the Irish Central Bank, Maurice Doyle, said there was a risk that in a single currency Ireland could become the Appalachia of Europe, that we would be some underdeveloped region of this great European currency zone. So from the beginning, therefore, as well as opening the economy, Ireland sought new political partners in its quest for development. In the first 30 years of independence, the United Kingdom had taken 90% of Irish exports. I remember as a child that you could buy Irish butter in England for 3 shillings, which was the old currency, maybe 30 cents in euros. And in Ireland we were paying 4 shillings and sixpence. We had to give our farmers a subsidy so they could sell the butter to Britain. Ireland also tied its currency to sterling after independence, which created sterling stability, but it also made the country dependent economically on its near neighbour. Once the country decided to adopt an open trading approach in the framework of an economic plan, Ireland also began to look for an international context in which it could pursue its development. While the European Economic Community had been agreed before the new Irish policy was adopted, it is interesting to note that Ireland did not join the European Free Trade Association, an organisation founded by those who were uncomfortable with the political aspects of European integration, such as the United Kingdom and Sweden. And we didn't join it. I asked the senior officials actually why we didn't join it, and we didn't join it because we were not comfortable with an international framework where the only thing that would matter would be free trade. While Ireland had been struggling in the 1950s, a major transformation had been taking place in Western Europe. Rising from the ashes of the war, the elites in France, West Germany and Italy, encouraged by the United States through its Marshall Plan, decided that future peace and prosperity could only be guaranteed by economic integration. In 1952, the 6 countries of France, Italy, West Germany, Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg placed their coal and steel industries under the control of a supranational authority, the Coal and Steel Community. This was a revolutionary development at the time, as coal and steel were then seen as the raw materials of both economic and military power. Those of you who remember your history will remember countries being compared not by GDP per capita, but by the amount of steel and coal they were able to produce. It was almost a sign of virility of nations. A more ambitious plan was then formed to create a European political and defence community, and this failed in 1954 when it was rejected by the French National Assembly. This, in fact, was an idea that just was too early, and there was at the time, of course, a lot of talk that Europe had failed, we would not see Europe progress. But in fact, the founding fathers of European integration, such as Jean Monnet, Robert Schuman, Konrad Adenauer, and Paul-Henri Spaak, and Alcide de Gasperi, came together and said, we can't stop now. And the Americans, in fairness, were very supportive of this approach. And they immediately began to push for an economic community, and they also agreed a European atomic community which dealt with civil nuclear energy in 1957. at a Treaty of Rome in March 1957, and this treaty started on the 1st of January 1958. It's interesting that all of those people I mentioned were, with the exception of Monet, were sort of outsiders. Schumann grew up in Alsace-Lorraine when it was occupied by Germany. Adenauer grew up in Cologne, in the borders of Germany. De Gasperi actually was a member of the Austro-Hungarian Parliament. He came from Trentino, and he was actually a member of the Austro-Hungarian Parliament at a very young age in the 1910s. And in fact, I understand that when they met, and Spaak, of course, was from Belgium, which is a country in itself that is maybe a model of European integration, that it brings together so many different cultures and communities. And when they met, they spoke German, because they all spoke good German from their childhood. Britain, of course, had been invited to the negotiations of the Treaty of Rome, and they withdrew from them. They thought the idea would never work. They thought it was a bad idea, and indeed there are many in Britain who probably still think this. Nobody in Ireland or Europe seriously considered Ireland as a candidate for membership. It just would have been unthinkable. Ireland was seen as so underdeveloped and so protectionist that nobody really thought it was possible. The key elements of the European Economic Community remain the central features of the European Union. Policy is driven by an independent commission, while decisions are taken by the Member States and the Council of Ministers, often by majority voting, and by the European Parliament, which has got more and more power over the years. The European Court of Justice ensures that all of the actors play by the rules. Pure economic policies such as free trade and freedom of movement for capital and labour are flanked by common social policies and common agricultural policies to avoid social dumping, convergence policies to assist less developed regions, and the common agriculture and fishery policies to ensure food security and rural development, and a common trade policy to ensure that Europe speaks with one voice in the world trade negotiations. Over the years, a wide range of other policy have been added, such as gender equality, environment, and so on, culture. The European Union, as it is now called, has common foreign security policy and has highly developed policies across a whole range of regions. The EEC proved to be a major impetus for growth in Europe. By removing customs duty, it radically increased trade within the region. At the same time, the United Kingdom was struggling. It was growing below the average, European average. It suffered continual currency crisis. And by 1961, the United Kingdom began to reconsider its rejection of the EEC, and it applied to become a member. Ireland, under the Mass, by now fully committed to its new economic policy, immediately applied for membership. We heard the British were going to apply, so we applied first, because we wanted to be first. We did in fact apply first. Unfortunately, however, the 6 founding members of the EEC were not at all convinced that Ireland was economically or politically ready for membership, and the then Prime Minister Taoiseach Sean Lemass had to lobby intensively. He had to visit each of the capitals, and he had to go before we were even invited to begin negotiations. And when you read the files, you can see the absolute paranoia in Dublin. The British were talking, the Norwegians were talking, the Danes were talking. Why was nobody talking to us? And their attitude was, well, you're like Greece, you need to wait for another 30 years. That was literally what they were saying to us. And of course, we were so tied to Britain, the thought of Britain going in without us was an absolute nightmare. In any event, Charles de Gaulle vetoed Britain's application in 1963. He vetoed it again in 1967, and that gave Ireland more time to prepare. Indeed, Britain, Ireland and Denmark had to wait for the arrival of President Pompidou as President of France in 1969 before accession negotiations began in earnest. In the 1960s, Ireland continued to grow and to invest in its own development. Its experience of the Anglo-Irish Free Trade Agreement of 1965 confirmed Ireland in its view that free trade on its own would not be sufficient. This agreement, which did help open up the economy, was supposed to ensure free trade between the two countries. But Britain, which suffered a number of foreign exchange crises over the late 60s, unilaterally imposed currency restrictions on Irish exporters to Britain. So they had to buy sterling to basically export into Britain. They had to buy bonds. And of course the government had to help them buy the bonds. Unlike in the European Economic Community, there was no supranational commission and there was no court of justice to enforce the agreement. And the Irish government had no choice but to accept British measures. I remember one professor telling me that we had theoretically free trade in woolen garments, and at one stage Irish woolen garments were doing very well in the British market, and the trade officials of Britain decided that the little nylon sticker that said made in Ireland, you know what I mean, on every jumper you have a little tag, that made it a synthetic garment, and it was immediately made subject to tariffs. So if you don't have a neutral arbiter, a neutral court, a neutral commission, it's very difficult to keep the rules straight. Ireland finally, with Britain and Denmark, joined the European Union on the 1st of January 1973, following a national referendum in which 83.1% voted in favour. The Norwegians rejected membership at that time and indeed have rejected it again since. And we turned the 6 into the 9. Membership of the European Union transformed Ireland's foreign economic policy, but it has to be admitted it was not a success immediately in economic terms. Following a decade and a half of strong economic and population growth up to 1973, Ireland was rocked by two oil crises, a slowing in reform, and the negative results of auction politics. We had one particular election in 1977 where it became a bidding war for the votes of the public, and as a result we had a very deep economic crisis in the 1980s caused by excessive government spending and borrowing. By 1986 indeed, the national debt of Ireland was reaching unsustainable levels. Unemployment was over 17%. Immigration had once again reached a very high level. In 1987, the government adopted a new approach. They cut government spending, they reformed the public service, they revived the industrial capacity of the country by encouraging direct investment, they increased investment in education again, and it was greatly helped in doing so by two factors. One was the world economy was doing well, which made it easy, and the second was there was a revival in the fortunes of the European Union. The European Union had gone through a period which is now described as Eurosclerosis, in that decisions were very hard to make, and in the 1980s. And there was indeed, if you read the press and the comment at the time, a view that the European Economic Community had really reached the limits of its achievement. I wasn't going to go much further. Then Jacques Delors, who had been the Minister of Finance in France, was appointed President of the European Commission in 1985, and Chancellor Kohl came into power in 1986, and he joined President Francois Mitterrand, who had been in power since 1981. And the European Union, driven by those three people, found a new sense of direction. In short order, the Single European Act, which made the single market work better, was adopted. Then the Maastricht Treaty, which agreed the euro, was also adopted. And at that time, the Iron Curtain fell, Germany reunited. It was a time of great political instability, and I think there was a recognition in Europe that if Europe didn't actually act in cohesion, we could have returned very quickly to the dark days of the 1930s. You might well ask why the European Union needed to create a single market in 1992 after we had theoretically created one in 1958. By 1962, I think 63, there were no customs duties in the European Economic Community. The answer, of course, is that the first wave of measures concentrated mainly on the abolition of tariffs between the member states. This left a myriad of other measures which had the effect of controlling trade. The Single European Act allowed these measures to be adopted by a qualified majority of member states. This cut through years of delay, and the single market created a new impetus for Europe. In addition to the single market, the European Union increased and streamlined its convergence and cohesion funding for less developed regions, and Ireland was a major beneficiary of that. I think in the peak year we got something like 5% of GDP in direct transfers from Europe. This funding was focused on productive investment, physical and human infrastructure, and assisted Ireland in taking advantage of the single market. In the 1990s, the European Union also began to reform its common agricultural policy. This policy had helped Ireland downsize the number of farms without social upheaval. You have to remember that in 1946, of the 1.1 million people, the 1,100,000 people working in the Republic of Ireland, 600,000 were working on farms. That was an extremely heavy agricultural figure. Today it's, I think, if you count agriculture in its broadest sense, it's something like 9% of the workforce is in agriculture. Which, of course, common agricultural policy had become extremely costly with the creation of milk lakes and buffer mountains, and every other type of mountain and lake you could think of. There was a wine lake as well. The new policy has eliminated these and was working well. The new European frameworks, combined with national policy, saw Ireland grow at an unprecedented rate. From 1995 to 2000, GDP growth ranged between 7.8 and 11.5%. It then slowed to between 4.4 and 6.5% from 2001 to 2007. During that period, Irish GDP per capita rose dramatically to equal and eventually surpass that of all but one state in Western Europe, Luxembourg. In 1999, Ireland joined the Eurozone and the Irish pound was replaced by the euro in January 2002. This enabled Ireland to borrow at historically low interest rates. In traditional terms, Ireland paid 4% above the Bundesbank rate. That was, if you look at the trend over decades, we paid more for our money, and the euro gave us cheap money. Unfortunately, however, the Celtic Tiger years came to a dramatic end. The global financial crisis revealed fundamental weaknesses in the Irish banking system. A boom in property and asset prices had been fueled by irresponsible lending, which had been enabled to some extent by our euro membership because we were able to borrow the money from Germany cheaply. The Irish government was forced to nationalise the entire national banking system, to liquidate a number of those banks at a very heavy cost. As of now, we have invested, and this is a country of 4.5 million people, we have invested 64 billion euro. That's roughly 4,000 euro for every, that's roughly 16,000 euro for every man, woman and child in the country into our banks. We're in the process of recouping some of that money, but at best we will end up paying something like 36 billion euro. It's an enormous amount of money. In the years between 2008 and 2011, our unemployment, which had been historically low, trebled to over 15%. Net immigration returned. Over the period of the Tiger, we had for the first time become a country of immigration. We have 150,000 Polish citizens living in Ireland at the moment because we opened our markets to Eastern Europe. The national debt rose to over 100% of GDP, and GDP itself fell by over 10%. Following over 2 years of efforts to tackle the crisis on our own resources, On the evening of 21st November 2010, Ireland formally requested financial support from the European Union's European Financial Stability Facility and from the International Monetary Fund. We basically lost our economic independence. It did so with great reluctance. We had no other choice, as basically on Monday the banks would have had no money. And those of you who want to see what happens when the banks have no money, I know that Russia has had its problems with banks in the 90s, but in Argentina in 2001 gives you an example of the social and political effects of such a thing. We basically agreed a €67.5 billion bailout that was put in place by the European Union, other European countries such as Britain and Sweden, Britain in particular. Norway, I think, gave us some as well, and the IMF as part of a total overall package of 85 billion. So we had to offer up our own national pension fund of 17 billion. The Irish state took the entire discretionary portfolio of its national pension reserve fund, and as part of the terms and conditions of the bailout programme, the Irish government agreed to a range of cost-cutting and revenue-increasing measures aimed at bringing Ireland's public finances under control. These terms and conditions continued to be met when a change of government occurred in March 2011 after the general election. By August 2011, the total funding for the Irish banks by the European Central Bank and the Irish Central Bank was running at 150 billion just to keep the banks running. And in any event, as I've explained, we will have paid 40 billion by the time we're finished. Needless to say, there was a very vigorous political debate about the bailout. And in the 2011 general election, the then Fianna Fáil Green government lost 3/4 of their parliamentary seats. To put this in context, the Fianna Fáil vote dropped to 17% of the national vote. In no election between 1932 and 2011 did Fianna Fáil get less than 39% of the vote. In fact, between 1932 and 2011, Fianna Fáil were in government for, I think, almost 70 years of that period. So it was, in political terms, an absolute cataclysm. And there were, of course, those who advocated default and leaving the euro, there still are. However, the new government, with strong popular support, committed to the bailout programme. And last December, following a number of very difficult years, Ireland left the bailout without recourse to contingency funding. This is an amazing achievement by any standards. And the economy is now recovering. The economy and asset prices are growing again. Ireland will have the strongest economic growth in the European Union this year. Ireland is borrowing at very low interest rates. We borrowed 30-year money for 2.3% recently. That's an astounding €4 billion for 30 years. As one economist said, that is a bubble in reverse. We actually borrowed 2-month money for minus 0.3% recently. It is a good time, if you have strong economic credentials, to be floating bonds. And the Irish government is buying as many bonds as it can, because it means we can reduce our debt servicing burden, which is quite high. We have staunched the bleeding from the banks. We finally liquidated the worst banks, and one of the banks is now independent again, Bank of Ireland. We hope that the other main pillar bank, Irish banks, will be a private bank in the coming 2 or 3 years. The government is looking at options on that. We currently own 99.8% of it. Employment is growing. Unemployment is falling. It's still over 10%, which is double what it was before the crisis. it would be, however, to gild the lily to say this didn't happen without real pain. People lost their houses, people lost their jobs. Every public servant, including myself, took a very severe cut in wages and a very severe increase in taxes. There is a lot of pain and a lot of political anger out there about the pain. The European Union itself has to some extent learned from its mistakes. Banking regulation has been tightened up, as has the economic coordination amongst member states. The Eurozone continues to suffer what can only be described as anemic growth. It is hoped that it too will resume its growth path in the near future. What is clear is that without the assistance of the European Union, Ireland would have had to undergo an economic adjustment which could be compared to undergoing surgery without an anaesthetic. If you talk to Irish farmers and you want to make them uncomfortable, you only need to say two words. The two words are New Zealand. Because in New Zealand in 1987, they were in the middle of an economic crisis. And to get out of it, they abolished every farm subsidy overnight. A third of New Zealand farms went out of business. The effect on New Zealand's rural society was cataclysmic. And that is the sort of decision we would have had to make if we hadn't had the bailout programme. The political and social impacts do not bear thinking about. Even after the recent crisis, Ireland remains a prosperous country. It has the 18th highest GDP per capita in the world. Independent studies rank Ireland first in the world for inward investment by quality and value, and it's the best country in Western Europe in which to invest. We rank first in the world for the flexibility and adaptability of our workforce, third in the world for the availability of skilled labour. We have a young, highly educated workforce in the only English-speaking country within the Eurozone. We have barrier-free access to 500 million consumers, some of the richest consumers on the planet. Dublin is ranked as the best city in the world for human capital. Our agri-food sector is performing particularly strongly. Exports increased to over 10 billion, almost 11 billion last year. Over 1,000 overseas companies have chosen Ireland as their strategic base in Europe. 8 of the top 10 global information technology firms, 9 of the world's top 10 pharmaceutical firms, all 10 of the largest online internet companies in the world operate from Ireland. During 2013, we had major investments in Ireland were announced by Deutsche Bank, Twitter, EMC, eBay, Salesforce, Novartis, Vistacom, Facebook, Zurich, Symantec, Qui, Yahoo, Sanofi, and Indeed.com. And I have yet to get the figure for 14. I must put that in my speech, but it's equally impressive. The same factors which draw overseas firms to Ireland make our indigenous enterprises and startups among the most dynamic and innovative in the world. Employment in Irish exporting companies grew strongly over the last 2 years, and Irish innovation in sectors such as information technology, medical devices and engineering is changing and enhancing people's lives around the world every day. And I've had the pleasure of seeing the innovation here and I think Russia, with its store of scientific achievement, can surely follow and indeed better the example of any other country in the world in making commercial use of its scientific research and innovation. What is the conclusion from my talk? Well, I would suggest 3 lessons from this account. The first is, if you are a small, open economy like Ireland, you will have benefited greatly from the membership of the European Union. In purely monetary terms, Ireland has received net contributions from the European Union of more than 40 billion euro between 1973 and 2007 inclusive. I think last year we became a net contributor for the first time. That is not inflation linked, so in real terms it's more than that. It's quite an astonishing figure. But more important perhaps is the fact that it has enabled Ireland to access the European market as an equal. It has allowed Ireland to bridge the development gap in Western Europe, and it is that it experienced for centuries, and it has enabled and at times compelled Ireland to modernise its public services and private enterprise. Second, European Union membership, of course, is not a panacea. We have twice in our membership of the European Union lost our way economically, in the 1980s and then in the recent past. EU membership will not of itself save a country from poor policy choices, poor political leadership, poor economic choices, and their consequences. But EU membership and membership of the Euro has enabled Ireland to weather from and recover from these storms. Thirdly, EU membership is not a charitable enterprise. The fundamental driving force underpinning the European Union is mutual self-interest. There was no question, for instance, of the European Union giving Ireland a blank cheque when its banks were on the point of collapse. The assistance was subject to tough conditions, just as our initial access to the EU entailed making difficult changes in the structure of our industry. But the key point is that the European Union policies are not imposed from above but hammered out by the member states in Brussels. The European Union is in that sense a collaborative body. And when I talk of the difficult choices, I come from the city of Cork, and in the city of Cork in 1980, the two biggest employers were a Ford assembly plant and a Dunlop's tyre plant, and they both closed within 2 years of each other, making 4,000 people redundant in a city of the time at 120,000 people. You can imagine the economic devastation caused by that, and that it was one of the prices we had to pay for European Union membership, because we could not protect these industries the way we had before we joined the European Union. The European Union can lead to much frustration. I spent a long part of my career dealing with the European Union, and I had a lot more here when I started than I have now. I can tell you, there are no easy decisions in the European Union. There's no one person such as a president, or indeed no one institution such as a parliament or a government which can decide on policy. Every decision has to be negotiated through a complex process. Many say indeed that the European Union is like a bumblebee. Under the laws of aerodynamics, the bumblebee should not be able to fly, but it does. From the outside, the European Union should not be able to work, but it does. And it has had its reverses both at the European and national level. The Irish public, for instance, have twice rejected European referenda on the Nice and Lisbon treaties. They have accepted them with conditions on the second time of asking. It's very hard to make the European Union popular, in fact, with people, because it is such a complex and bureaucratic body. As most of you will be aware, there is an ongoing discussion between the new Greek government and its European partners about the conditions for continued economic assistance to Greece. We've now had 2 failed rounds of negotiations. I noticed last night there was another collapse. I would, however, be hopeful that the long-standing tradition within the European Union of solving difficult problems will win through again on this occasion. There have been many European negotiations where there have been 5, 6, 7 collapses before the final deal was done. In this case, of course, maybe it's a little bit more urgent, given that Greece has economic problems. Overall, the European Union has been an outstanding success, and Ireland's experience of the European Union has been an outstanding success. It has, for instance, been a key stabilising factor in Eastern Europe by giving the peoples of the post-communist states a European perspective. It now faces major challenges. You can list them. The euro is a challenge, the anemic growth is a challenge, the need for labour market reforms within member states is a challenge. Immigration is becoming an increasingly difficult challenge for Europe. it of course started at a time when, with countries who had been at war with each other. You know, it started at a time with countries that had been destroyed by each other. And it started at a time when there was a strong view in some quarters that capitalism itself could not work, that Christian democracy, liberal democracy in Western Europe could not work. And it started with many enemies who said that this concept was unworkable and so on. And it has survived and developed. And I have every confidence that it will continue to do so. And if one thing it has going for it is the alternatives to the European Union, any that I can think of at least, for a country like Ireland, are far, far worse. So thank you very much. I hope that's been